Battle of Preston, 1648, Cromwell's final gambit to end the English Civil War. Imagine a showdown so fierce, so pivotal, that it wasn't just swords and muskets clashing, it was England itself deciding its fate. What could drive Cromwell, England's most relentless general, to march his men into Preston under stormy skies? Why did the Royalists, once filled with high hopes, find themselves fleeing in every direction, their once proud banners abandoned in the mud? And how, amidst this swirling chaos, did a captured king become the bargaining chip in a tug-of-war that would shake the foundations of Parliament and monarchy alike? Journey with us to 1648, where the drums of war beat for what seemed like the final time. A time when Prince Rupert's Bristol blunder set the stage for disaster, when Royalist dreams turned to dust, and where Cromwell, crossing his own Rubicon, took his greatest gamble, one that would see him seize both London and the king. This is no ordinary tale of battle. It's a tale of survival, schemes, and the very edge of treachery. Ready to step into history's most dangerous game? The year was 1648, and though England was no stranger to bloodshed, the country was growing exhausted. Years of civil war had torn it apart, transforming cities into battlegrounds and friends into enemies. On one side were the Royalists, allied with the Scots under the Duke of Hamilton, who aimed to march south to reclaim the throne for the imprisoned King Charles I. On the other was the indomitable Oliver Cromwell, the unshakable commander of the new model army, determined to end what he saw as the tyrannical aspirations of King Charles I once and for all. Years earlier, in 1645, the once mighty Prince Rupert had been appointed governor of Bristol, the last great stronghold and industrial heart of the Royalist cause. Bristol was Charles's prized city, his main source of manufacturing, and a crucial port for supplies from Ireland. To lose it was unthinkable. "Your Majesty," Prince Rupert had boasted, chest puffed and sword at his side, "Bristol will stand against the enemy until at least Christmas. You have my word." Confident in his fortifications, Rupert was convinced he could outlast any siege. But confidence is a fragile thing in the face of reality. Sir Thomas Fairfax, Cromwell's fellow general, approached Bristol with a strategy Rupert hadn't anticipated. Rather than a direct attack, Fairfax encircled the city and starved it out. In a mere 18 days, Fairfax's forces broke Rupert's morale and Bristol's defenses. On September 10th, Rupert surrendered, securing mercy for himself and his men, who were escorted to Oxford in disgrace. When the king heard of the surrender, his heart broke. It was a betrayal from his own kin. In a letter to Rupert, Charles' words were laden with both sorrow and accusation. "What is to be done after one who is so dear and near to me, both in blood and friendship, submits himself to so mean an action?" It was a wound that would never heal for the royal family. The bad news didn't stop there. Just 3 days after Rupert's retreat from Bristol, a message arrived in Oxford bearing news that turned hopes into ash. Charles's last bastion in Scotland, the fearless Marquis of Montrose, had been soundly defeated at Philiphaugh, his army utterly destroyed. There would be no salvation from the north. The situation for the king was dire. With options dwindling, King Charles attempted to regroup. He aimed to reach Chester, where he hoped for reinforcements from Irish allies. But when he arrived on September 23rd, he was met with Parliament's forces. Outmaneuvered, he was forced to retreat to Oxford. The Royalists' grip on England was slipping with every passing day. By early 1646, the new model army controlled most of the country, a relentless tide the king could not withstand. In a desperate move, King Charles sent his heir, the young Prince of Wales, to France for safekeeping. Meanwhile, the Royalist forces dwindled further. On March 21, 1646, a Royalist contingent of 3,000, led by Lord Astley, was intercepted at Stow-on-the-Wold by the new model army's Richard Brereton. Astley's men, worn and beaten, surrendered with barely a fight. As he was led away, Astley famously remarked to a young soldier beside him, "O boys, you have done your work and may now go play, unless you fall out among yourselves." The old soldier knew that the war was lost, even if his king would not accept it. Back in Oxford, King Charles slipped away with just 2 loyal companions, heading north. His flight marked the beginning of secret negotiations with the Scottish Covenanters. Though Parliament had treated them poorly, the Scots still believed they could control the king, coaxing him to Presbyterianism. Charles, ever the schemer, held out, hoping to secure a better deal while remaining true to his royal pride. Finally, on May 5th, he surrendered to the Scots at Newark, only to be transferred to Newcastle. Here, his captors debated what to do with their royal pawn, all while Charles hoped to turn the tables in his favor. In January 1647, a deal was struck. King Charles would be sold to the English Parliament for the hefty sum of £400,000, satisfying the Scots' monetary demands. The Scots, weary of Charles' evasions and unwilling to impose their beliefs on an unwilling king, took their gold and returned north. Charles was handed over to Parliament, finding himself a prisoner once more, though this time in Holdenby House. His journey northward drew curious onlookers, crowds who cheered and waved for the king they still viewed as their rightful sovereign. Meanwhile, in London, without the threat of King Charles to unify them, Parliament's own factions began to splinter. The Presbyterian moderates sought peace, even reinstating the new model army's infantry without pay. This enraged the soldiers, many of whom had been unpaid for years, and who believed that their struggle had been for a new era of equality, free from the tyranny of both king and Parliament. These levelers dreamed of a society where wealth and privilege no longer ruled. Tensions rose to a boiling point, with Cromwell, a pragmatic leader, realizing he had to choose sides. Under the cloak of night, Cromwell dispatched George Joyce, an agitator known for his skill in inspiring troops, to Holdenby. With his troopers in tow, Joyce took King Charles into custody, bringing him to Newmarket, where Cromwell himself waited. But Charles was unfazed. He still believed he could outwit Cromwell and Parliament by exploiting their divisions. Even as he conversed with Cromwell, Charles continued to negotiate with the Scots, hoping for an opening. In London, riots broke out, driven by taxes and the lack of progress toward peace. The violence forced independent MPs, including the Speaker of the House, to flee to the new model army for protection. Legitimately backed by Parliament's own Speaker, Cromwell and Fairfax led their troops into London, asserting control over the capital and sending a clear message: order would be restored, and Parliament would submit to the will of the people. Or at least, the will of the army. While under supposed house arrest at Hampton Court, Charles continued his schemes. Fearing that Cromwell's army could topple his rule completely, he entered a secret deal with the Scots known as the Engagement. In exchange for their support, Charles promised to impose Presbyterianism across England. But Cromwell's patience had worn thin. Parliament, too, had grown tired of the king's endless plots and evasions. In early 1648, the Scots declared war on Parliament, rallying under Charles's banner once again, though with far less enthusiasm than before. It was a stormy summer day on July 8, 1648, when the Duke of Hamilton, rallying a sizable force of around 10,000 Scots, boldly crossed into northern England. With the Scottish flag billowing in the gusts, Hamilton's troops were met with cheer and relief by Sir Marmaduke Langdale's 4,000 beleaguered Royalists at Carlisle. Their alliance was a long time coming, but as the footsore English soldiers clapped the Scots on the back, no one yet suspected this alliance of sheer numbers and ragtag willpower might carry a deadly weakness. Their goal? To reclaim England for King Charles I, the ever-monarch still clinging to his divine right despite God's will having landed him defeated and humiliated. But Hamilton, his eyes on glory, gave little thought to the hard reality facing him. Discipline was thin, supplies were stretched, and the sheer momentum of such a force posed as many risks unyielding as promises. Imagine stepping into history's most thrilling moments, feeling the courage, heartbreak, and ambition that shaped our world. Here on our channel, we don't just tell stories, we bring them to life, sparking curiosity, wonder, and excitement in every episode. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you're not only joining a community of history lovers, you're supporting deeper dives, bolder content, and the chance to experience history like never before. Together, let's keep these stories alive and growing. Subscribe now and be part of this incredible journey. You won't want to miss a single moment. Cromwell, eyeing this march with characteristic distaste, wasn't one to back down from an underdog's position. He immediately ordered his own veteran, battle-hardened parliamentarians to fall back to the safety of Barnard Castle. preserving them as Hamilton's forces pushed south. "Let them come," he muttered to his officers, grinning with grim resolve. "They may march in numbers, but we shall be the ones who march with purpose." But what Cromwell could never have planned was the unexpected boon of a Scottish delay. Caught between logistics and impatience, Hamilton called off his own offensive, leaving his force idling in Carlisle as supplies trickled slowly in from Scotland and Ireland. The delay was costly. Unbeknownst to him, it allowed Cromwell's forces time to reinforce. By August 12th, Cromwell, joined by General Lambert at Wetherby, had amassed an intimidating 9,000-strong army, veterans of prior campaigns, trained in swift movements and coordinated strikes. Intent on intercepting the Scottish march, Cromwell shed his artillery, pushing his army through the Ribble Valley with the speed and stealth of a man gambling everything on one decisive blow. He knew he'd be outnumbered, but as he liked to remind his troops with a chuckle, God himself has chosen the righteous side. So onward they went, leaving behind the lumbering artillery and covering ground fast enough to catch the Scots at their least prepared. August 16th arrived in Lancashire, bringing rain and a dense fog as Hamilton's army came to a halt at Preston Moor, planning to cross the Ribble River by dawn. Langdale, meanwhile, set up camp 4 miles away at Longridge, unaware of Cromwell's approach. Confidence was high among the Royalists. Little did they know, Cromwell's army, some 9,000 soldiers burning with purpose, was encamped at Stonyhurst Park, a mere stone's throw from the Scots. The early morning air was still damp when the silence of Preston was broken by a sudden skirmish. A small vanguard from Cromwell's forces had engaged Langdale's surprised men. Langdale, thinking it was the entire parliamentary army, rode furiously to Hamilton, hoping to rally a defense. But Hamilton, counseled by optimistic officers, decided to continue the river crossing. For hours, Langdale's forces engaged in skirmishes with Cromwell's vanguard, the sounds of clashing steel echoing through the mist-covered fields. As the skirmishes turned fiercer, Cromwell ordered a full advance, unleashing his new model army in a tidal wave of discipline and deadly intent. The battle's ground, a chaotic patchwork of irrigation ditches, lanes, and hedges, favored Cromwell's drilled infantry, who used the terrain to launch relentless assaults against the disorganized Royalists. Langdale's lines began to falter, his hastily assembled recruits no match for Cromwell's veterans. As word of Langdale's collapse reached Hamilton, the situation spiraled into disaster. His soldiers, stuck in the river or scattered across the bank, were forced into a desperate retreat toward Preston. But Cromwell was already tightening his trap. Pinned between Cromwell's advancing army and the river, Hamilton's forces tried to form a last-minute defense around the Ribble Bridge, hoping to regroup. But Cromwell's marksmen had already captured the high ground, their muskets picking off the Scots with merciless precision. Forced to abandon their ammunition and supplies, the Scots attempted a frenzied retreat across the bridge, losing scores of men in the confusion. As night descended on August 17, Hamilton barely escaped, regrouping with the remnants of his army only to meet another defeat the next day at Winwick. The Scots' attempt to regroup became another slaughter as Cromwell's infantry closed in. Exhausted, isolated, and outmaneuvered, Hamilton and his surviving officers surrendered on August 20th. The days after Cromwell's decisive victory at Preston were filled with swift decisions and bitter reckonings. For Cromwell, Hamilton's capture was a triumph, the final piece of his meticulously planned gamble. The Duke of Hamilton was no longer the proud commander of Scotland's forces, but a battered prisoner brought in chains before Cromwell himself. Hamilton, a figure of noble birth and high ambitions, now found himself stripped of dignity. When Cromwell's officers led him, weary and grim, into the parliamentarian camp, Cromwell sized him up with a cool, appraising glance. "A man with great plans," Cromwell remarked dryly, "bested by greater ones." Hamilton's fate was sealed before he could even attempt a rebuttal. Parliament deemed him a traitor, and soon after he was led to his execution at Bolton, his own boldness now his undoing. Meanwhile, across England, resentment simmered against the Royalists. The parliamentarian forces, tired of the repeated conflicts and bloodshed, decided to send a clear message to Royalist diehards. Fairfax, the commander-in-chief, was incensed by the unnecessary prolonging of the war and the destruction it brought to English soil. As a warning to others, Sir George Lisle and Sir Charles Lucas, two of the most loyal and defiant Royalist commanders, were executed, their names becoming symbols of obstinate resistance, punished with steel. But the most dramatic judgment was reserved for Charles I, the man of blood. His defiance of Parliament had left scars too deep to heal. As the echoes of battle quieted, the noise of impending judgment grew louder. Parliament issued charges of tyranny, betrayal, and treason. They accused him of plunging England into a bloody civil war to satisfy his desire for absolute power, defying the people's will and ignoring the divine signs to step down. Charles was brought to trial at Westminster Hall in London in January 1649, facing the music of his own people. The trial was a spectacle, attended by anxious crowds and guarded by a wary parliamentarian army. Charles stood resolute, not with the humble humility one might expect, but with an air of royal disdain, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of his trial. But Parliament's will was resolute. The verdict, death by beheading. For the first time in English history, a king was to be executed, his blood viewed as a necessary cleansing for the sins he had brought upon the land. The execution was held outside the banqueting house at Whitehall, and the atmosphere was heavy with foreboding. On a cold January day, Charles walked to the scaffold dressed in black, maintaining a stoic dignity that even his fiercest critics acknowledged. As he looked out over the assembled crowd, he spoke calmly, defending his actions as the will of a king answerable only to God. But the crowd, hardened by years of civil strife, was unmoved. With one swift strike, the executioner brought down the axe, and Charles I's reign came to a brutal and final end. In his death, England's future was altered forever. The monarchy was abolished, and in its place, Cromwell's Commonwealth rose, intent on reshaping England's destiny not as a kingdom, but as a republic of the people. This, then, was the finale of Cromwell's gamble, a new era built on a foundation of ambition, conviction, and bloodshed. England would no longer be governed by the divine right of kings, but by men who wielded power not by birth, but by their actions and resolve. And for those who want to keep delving into these incredible stories of history, don't miss out. Follow us, hit that subscribe button, and make sure to turn on notifications so you'll be the first to catch our next thrilling tale from history.